King Charles's accent is basically classic received pronunciation, RP. This was the upper class accent during the last century or so of the British Empire. There aren't that many speakers of it left because the huge social changes in Britain starting in the 1960s rapidly made it sound very posh and old-fashioned. Today's standard accent in the south of Britain is called Standard Southern British, SSB. Charles was just old enough for his accent to be fixed before the swinging 60s. Unfortunately, another thing that got fixed before the swinging 60s was the set of vowel symbols that you find in most dictionaries for British English. This means that King Charles is one of the few people who actually sounds like these symbols. For example, the vowel in the word price in modern SSB begins quite far back in the mouth, I. But the king actually pronounces it like the familiar symbol, I, beginning with a more front quality.
Recent times.
He also pronounces the vowels of dress and face like the familiar symbols, and a.
Ahead. Plays.
In SSB, those are more open, and a. On the other hand, in today's SSB, the vowel in the word choice is quite close, oi, whereas the king has the more open RP vowel, oi. This means that when he says the word joy, it begins rather like the word job.
Times of joy.
The king even has a couple of vowels that are actually posher and more old-fashioned than the symbols. One is the vowel of goat, which in the familiar symbol begins with schwa, as it does in SSB, o. But the king begins the vowel further forward in the mouth, o. And his mouth vowel is quite different from today's ow, starting a bit further back in the mouth and with no lip rounding at all.
Extremely proud.
Brits sometimes make fun of this posh old vowel by writing house as heis. A difference in his weak syllables is the so-called happy vowel. Today, SSB speakers have the same vowel in both syllables of the word deeply. But in the King's RP, the word ends with the lax I of kit, deeply. Now let's move on to consonants. One rather posh old-fashioned feature here is the weakening of the T sound to a kind of S. This might be the word sing.
Sing.
But that's actually the second half of the word fighting.
Have been fighting.
Now, if you've seen my first video on aspiration, you'll know that in SSB, T is typically affricated. In other words, pronounced with a little S-type release, t. Well, in the King's speech, when T is in what we call a weak position, it often is transformed entirely into a fricative, and we call this spirantization. This can also be heard in Liverpool and Ireland.
Devoted. Planet.
Occasionally the King uses American-style T voicing, as here in the word 40.
In 1947.
But one kind of T weakening that posh people like the King never do is pronouncing a T as a glottal stop before a vowel, as demonstrated here by our new Prime Minister.
Britain is the great country it is today. It is today.
Weakening is something that the King does a lot more generally. He has occasionally been described as mumbling, but in my book English After RP, I actually devote a chapter to this relaxed, somewhat weakened style of speech that I think was characteristic of many RP speakers. Here are some words with sounds that in the King's speech are reduced or missing altogether.
Such trying circumstances. Biodiversity. Ladies and gentlemen. The whole of the common.
Of course, we all do this kind of thing when we're chatting casually, but the King does it in formal public speaking. Sometimes it involves racing through the words at lightning speed.
Incredibly difficult for us all. Incredibly difficult for us all.
You try saying those words at that speed. I think this really shows that what we're talking about here isn't laziness, but an actual style of speaking. Now, the king does often emphasise words or syllables, but rather than doing this by articulating clearly, he often prefers to do it by gesturing with his head or his whole body.
Rapid decline, many of you, planet, or even the internet.
Obviously, there are other things we could discuss. For example, I haven't even mentioned voice quality, or the facial mannerisms that impressionists like to pick up on. But that's enough for this video. So please do like and subscribe